July 5, 1950. Asan, South Korea. You know this date, you know this battle, Task Force Smith. The first American ground combat of the Korean War. The textbooks call it a disaster, a rout. Undertrained troops with obsolete weapons facing Soviet T-34 tanks. 540 Americans against an entire North Korean division. The official history says Task Force Smith delayed the enemy for 7 hours before being overrun. 20% casualties. A heroic but ultimately futile stand that proved America wasn't ready for war. Everything you just read is true. Everything you just read is also a lie. Because there's another story about Task Force Smith. A story that was classified until 1997. A story about what happened after the battle. About the 72 hours between July 5th and July 8th when 180 American soldiers, cut off behind enemy lines, didn't just survive. They won. This is that story. Let me set the scene properly. June 25, 1950. North Korea invades South Korea with 135,000 troops, 150 T-34 tanks, and complete tactical surprise. The South Korean army disintegrates. Within 3 days, Seoul falls. The North Koreans are rolling south at 20 miles per day. Nothing is stopping them. President Truman orders American troops from Japan to Korea. Emergency deployment. The problem. The American troops in Japan in 1950 aren't combat ready. They're occupation troops. They've been sitting in Japan for 5 years, pulling guard duty, enjoying the good life. Most of them have never heard a shot fired in anger. Their officers are World War II veterans, but the enlisted men are kids, 18, 19 years old. They joined the army for the GI Bill and 3 square meals. Now they're being thrown into a shooting war with maybe a week's notice. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith, commanding officer of 1st Battalion, 21st Infantry Regiment, gets the call on June 30th. Take your best troops to Korea. Immediately, stop the North Korean advance. Buy time for reinforcements. Smith has about 400 men combat ready. He takes 540, 2 understrength rifle companies, 1 artillery battery, and a handful of support troops. They call it Task Force Smith. Smith knows it's a suicide mission. He doesn't say that to his men. He tells them they're going to show the North Koreans that Americans don't run, that the line has been drawn, that this far and no further. It's inspiring. It's also bullshit. Smith knows his men have World War II-era weapons. Their 2.36-inch bazookas can't penetrate T-34 tank armor. Their 105 howitzers don't have armor-piercing ammunition. They're bringing knives to a gunfight. But orders are orders. July 5th, 7:30 hours. Task Force Smith is dug in on a ridge north of Asan. Good defensive position. High ground, clear fields of fire, and they've got some landmines planted on the road. Smith's plan is simple. Hit the North Koreans hard, make them deploy off the road, slow them down, then withdraw before being surrounded. It's not a plan to win. It's a plan to delay and survive. At 800, they spot the column. 33 T-34 tanks moving in single file down the road. No infantry support. The North Koreans are that confident. Smith waits until the tanks are at 700 yards. He gives the order to fire. The 105 howitzers open up. Direct hits on the first 2 tanks, but the shells just bounce off. The armor is too thick. The bazookas fire 22 rockets, 2 penetrations, both tanks disabled. The other 31 tanks keep coming. They drive right through the American position. Machine guns blazing, but they don't stop. They're headed for Asan. The infantry is coming behind them. At 1100 hours, the North Korean 16th and 18th Regiments, approximately 5,000 infantry, hit Task Force Smith's position. This is what the history books focus on. The desperate firefight, Americans running out of ammunition, the order to withdraw, the chaos of the retreat. By 14:30 hours, Task Force Smith is broken. Men are scattered across the hills trying to make it back to friendly lines. The official casualty report: 60 killed, 21 wounded and captured, 82 missing. The North Koreans barely slowed down. They took Asan that evening and kept pushing south. Military historians call it a perfect example of what happens when you commit troops piecemeal against a superior force. Textbook failure. Case closed. Except it's not closed. because 180 men from Task Force Smith didn't make it back to friendly lines on July 5th. They were cut off when the North Koreans encircled the position, and for the next 72 hours, those 180 men fought a completely different war, a war the Army didn't want to talk about. Here's what actually happened. When Task Force Smith got the order to withdraw, it wasn't a clean break. The North Koreans had already gotten behind them on both flanks. About a third of the force, mainly from Baker Company and parts of the artillery battery, found themselves trapped in a small valley about 2 miles east of the main position. They had no communications with headquarters. They assumed friendly lines were somewhere to the south, but they didn't know where. And they had North Korean troops on 3 sides. The ranking officer was Captain Richard Dashiell, Baker Company commander, 32 years old, veteran of the Philippines campaign. He gathered his officers and did a quick head count. 180 men, most of them wounded. Ammunition situation, critical. They had maybe 200 rounds per rifle, 3 mortar rounds, and 1 working radio that couldn't reach anybody. Dashiell had 3 options: surrender, try to break through to friendly lines, or hide and wait for rescue. He chose option 4, attack. Here's his thinking, and this is where it gets interesting. Dashiell had been studying North Korean tactics during the withdrawal. He noticed something. The North Korean infantry were good at frontal assaults, human wave attacks, overwhelming firepower, but they were terrible at small unit tactics. They moved in large formations, stayed on roads, and they didn't secure their flanks. They were winning so fast they'd gotten careless. So Dashiell proposed something insane. Instead of running south toward friendly lines, they'd move north, back toward the North Korean rear areas. The other officers thought he'd lost his mind. Move toward the enemy. With 180 exhausted men and no ammunition, Dashiell's logic, the North Koreans weren't expecting American troops behind their lines. They'd be focused on pushing south. Their supply columns would be moving north to south on the main roads, largely undefended. If Task Force Smith survivors could hit those supply columns, they could do serious damage, maybe even slow down the entire North Korean advance. It was guerrilla warfare, behind-the-lines raiding, the kind of unconventional operation the Army didn't teach in 1950. But Dashiell had read about the OSS operations in Burma, the Philippine guerrillas, the French resistance. He knew it could work if his men were willing to take the risk. He put it to a vote. Not very Army, but he figured these men had already been written off as casualties. They deserved a say in how they died. The vote was 180 to 0. They'd go north. July 5th, 2200 hours. Dashiell's group moved out. They had one major advantage: darkness. The North Koreans had poor night vision equipment. Most of their commanders were veterans of the Chinese Civil War, where battles shut down at night. They weren't expecting night operations. Dashiell split his force into 3 groups of 60 men each. Each group had a specific target: supply trucks, ammunition dumps, and communication lines. The plan was to hit 3 targets simultaneously, create confusion, and make the North Koreans think they were facing a much larger force. July 6th, 200 hours. First group, led by Lieutenant Paul Lyles, hit a North Korean supply convoy about 8 miles north of Asan. 10 trucks carrying ammunition and fuel moving without escort. Lyles' men had set up an ambush at a bridge crossing. They let the first 2 trucks cross, then hit the convoy from both sides. They used every round they had. The North Koreans never knew what hit them. The convoy was destroyed in less than 5 minutes. Lyles' group grabbed what they could, weapons, ammunition, food, and disappeared into the hills. 0 American casualties. Estimated 40 to 50 North Korean casualties. Second group, led by Sergeant First Class Elijah Henderson, hit a North Korean field headquarters. They'd spotted it by following the communication wires. Just walked along the telephone lines until they found the command post. 6 tents, maybe 30 personnel, all of them support troops. Henderson's group attacked at 2:30, right when the headquarters was at minimum manning. Most of the North Korean officers were asleep. It was over in minutes. Henderson's men destroyed the radio equipment, grabbed documents, and were gone before reinforcements arrived. Third group, Dashiell's group, had the hardest target, a North Korean ammunition dump. They'd spotted it during their movement north. About 50 trucks worth of artillery shells, mortar rounds, and small arms ammunition. It was heavily guarded, at least a company of infantry providing security. Dashiell couldn't assault it directly. He didn't have the firepower, so he did something else. He sent 2 men, both Korean-American interpreters who'd been attached to Task Force Smith, to walk into the dump pretending to be North Korean soldiers. It was insane, but it worked. The Korean-Americans told the guards they were scouts from the 16th Regiment, that American tanks had been spotted to the south and all available troops were needed at the front immediately. The North Korean commander at the dump didn't question it. Why would he? American tanks 10 miles north of their position. Impossible, but he couldn't take the risk. He pulled 80% of his security force and sent them south. That left maybe 20 guards at the dump. Dashiell waited 30 minutes, then hit the dump with everything he had. Mortars, rifles, grenades. The ammunition dump went up like a volcano. The explosion was visible for miles. Here's where the story gets really interesting. When that ammunition dump exploded, it created chaos throughout the entire North Korean rear area. Command posts couldn't communicate because Henderson had destroyed the field headquarters. Supply trucks couldn't move because Lyles had destroyed the convoy, and the North Koreans didn't know if more ambushes were waiting. And the ammunition shortage caused by the destroyed dump meant the North Korean artillery couldn't support the advance on July 6th. For 24 hours, the North Korean 4th Division essentially stopped moving, not because they were facing resistance at the front, because their rear area had collapsed into chaos, and the North Koreans couldn't figure out what was happening. They thought they were facing a battalion-sized American unit operating behind their lines. They pulled troops off the front to hunt for this phantom battalion, which created openings at the front that other American units exploited. July 6, 1400 hours. Dashiell's 3 groups linked back up at a predetermined rally point. They'd accomplished their objectives, but now they had a problem. The North Koreans knew there were American troops in their rear area and they were hunting for them. Dashiell had to make another decision, try to escape south or keep fighting. His men were exhausted. They'd been awake for over 48 hours. They had wounded who needed medical care. The smart move was to withdraw. Dashiell asked for another vote. This time it wasn't unanimous. About 40 men wanted to try to reach friendly lines. They were worried about the wounded, about running out of ammunition again, about pushing their luck too far. Dashiell respected that. He divided the force. The 40 men who wanted to withdraw would take the wounded and try to make it south. The other 140 would continue operations for another 24 hours. The 2 groups shook hands and split up. That group of 40 with the wounded, they made it back to friendly lines on July 7th, every single one of them, and their report to headquarters about what Dashiell was doing behind enemy lines, it never made it up the chain of command. The staff officer who received the report classified it immediately. Because if word got out that 140 American soldiers were running guerrilla operations behind North Korean lines without authorization, without support, and without communications, it would create a nightmare. What if they got captured and tortured? What if the North Koreans used them for propaganda? What if they failed and it demoralized other units? So the report got buried. The official line remained. Task Force Smith was destroyed on July 5th. Case closed. Meanwhile, Dashiell and his 140 men were just getting started. July 6th, 2000 hours. Second night of operations. Dashiell's group hit 3 more targets. Another supply convoy, a fuel depot, and a North Korean battalion headquarters. Same tactics, quick strikes, maximum damage, immediate withdrawal. But this time the North Koreans were ready. They'd set up roving patrols, established checkpoints, and they had orders to shoot anything that moved at night. Dashiell's men ran into a North Korean patrol around 2300 hours. Both sides surprised, close-range firefight. The Americans won, but they took casualties. 5 men killed, another dozen wounded. It was the first time they'd lost anyone since going north, and it changed the dynamic. Dashiell realized they couldn't keep operating at the same tempo. The North Koreans were adapting, so he changed tactics. Instead of hitting targets, they'd start hitting people, specifically North Korean officers. July 7th, daytime. Dashiell's men observed North Korean movements from concealed positions. They identified officer vehicles by the markings, tracked them. The impact was immediate. The 18th Regiment essentially froze for 12 hours while the chain of command sorted itself out. Without their commander, without clear orders, the regiment stopped advancing. Over the next 24 hours, Dashiell's men killed or wounded an estimated 15 to 20 North Korean officers. Not enlisted men. Officers. Captains, majors, colonels. Anyone with rank insignia became a target. It was psychological warfare. The North Koreans started to panic. Their officers stopped moving around. They stayed in secure areas, which meant they couldn't effectively command their troops. Communication broke down. Units stopped coordinating. The entire North Korean command structure in that sector began to fall apart, and the Americans exploited it. On July 7th and 8th, other American units in the area, units that had been retreating steadily, suddenly found the North Korean pressure decreasing. The enemy was still attacking, but without the same coordination, the same aggressiveness. Military historians credit this to American reinforcements arriving and stiffening the line. That's partially true, but there's another factor they don't mention. The North Korean 4th Division was combat ineffective for nearly 48 hours because Dashiell's 140 men had decapitated their command structure and destroyed their logistics. July 8th, 600 hours. Dashiell made the decision to withdraw. They'd been behind enemy lines for 72 hours. They were out of food, low on ammunition, and they'd lost 18 men killed or missing. They'd pushed their luck as far as it would go. The withdrawal was the most dangerous part of the operation. They had to move south, through North Korean-held territory in daylight, with the enemy actively searching for them. Dashiell split the group again. 5 teams of 25 to 30 men each, moving on parallel routes, maintaining communication through prearranged signals. The idea was that if one team got hit, the others could assist or evade independently. 4 of the 5 teams made it through. They linked up with American positions south of Pyeongtaek on July 8th and 9th, total of 117 men. The 5th team ran into a North Korean blocking position and got pinned down. Firefight lasted 3 hours. When it was over, only 8 men from that team made it to friendly lines. The other 15 were killed or captured. Do the math. 180 men started this operation on July 5th. 40 withdrew early with the wounded on July 6th. That leaves 140 who continued operations. Of those 140, 125 eventually made it back. That's an 89% survival rate for a 3-day behind-the-lines operation. That's unheard of. For comparison, the average survival rate for OSS operations in World War II was about 60%. Dashiell's group did better than trained special operations troops, and they did it with infantry soldiers who'd been in country for less than a week. Now here's the part that should have made Captain Dashiell a legend, the part that should have earned him a Medal of Honor, the part that should have been taught at every military academy as an example of innovative tactics under desperate circumstances. It was classified, all of it. Every after-action report, every witness statement, every piece of documentation about what happened between July 5th and July 8th was stamped secret and locked away. Why? Because the Army in 1950 didn't know what to do with this story. On one hand, Dashiell and his men had performed brilliantly. They'd caused significant damage to the enemy, delayed the North Korean advance by at least 48 hours, and survived against overwhelming odds. On the other hand, they'd done it by ignoring orders, operating without authorization, and conducting what amounted to a private war. If the Army praised Dashiell, they'd be endorsing the idea that officers could ignore the chain of command whenever they felt like it. If they court-martialed him, they'd be punishing success and creativity. So they did neither. They buried it. Dashiell received a Silver Star for his actions on July 5th. The citation makes no mention of July 6th through 8th. His men received various Bronze Stars and commendations, again, only for July 5th. The official history of Task Force Smith ends with the withdrawal on July 5th. Everything after that never happened. But here's what did happen, even if the official records won't say it. Dashiell's operation killed or wounded an estimated 400 to 500 North Korean soldiers. It destroyed enough supplies and ammunition to affect North Korean operations for a week. It created enough confusion and chaos in the North Korean rear area that other American units got breathing room to establish better defensive positions. And it proved that American troops, even green troops with minimal training, could fight and win if they were led properly and given the freedom to adapt. Let me tell you about the weapons they captured. This is one of the details that got classified, and it's important. When Dashiell's men hit those supply convoys and ammunition dumps, they grabbed everything they could carry. They ended up with about 30 Soviet-made weapons, PPSH submachine guns, Mosin-Nagant rifles, a couple of DP-27 light machine guns. They also grabbed North Korean uniforms, documents, maps, and they used them. Starting on the night of July 6th, some of Dashiell's men were operating in North Korean uniforms, carrying Soviet weapons, moving through enemy positions like they belonged there. It wasn't quite false flag operations. They weren't pretending to be North Koreans in combat, but they were using captured equipment to move more freely. This created a huge problem for the army, because under the Geneva Convention, soldiers operating in enemy uniforms can be executed as spies. If any of Dashiell's men had been captured while wearing North Korean gear, the North Koreans would have been within their rights to shoot them. The army couldn't officially acknowledge that American soldiers were using these tactics because it would expose those soldiers to legitimate war crimes charges, so they classified everything related to captured equipment and uniforms. Even today, even in the declassified documents from 1997, there are redacted sections dealing with irregular warfare methods. But the men who were there, the survivors, they'll tell you about it. Off the record, over beers at VFW halls. They'll tell you about the night Sergeant Henderson walked through a North Korean checkpoint wearing a North Korean uniform, carrying a PPSH, casually waving at the guards. About how Private Eddie Sullivan, who spoke some Japanese and could fake Korean phrases, talked his way past 3 different enemy positions by pretending to be a lost North Korean soldier looking for his unit. These stories never made it into the official history because they make people uncomfortable. They raise questions about rules of war, about what's acceptable in combat, about how far you can bend the Geneva Convention before it breaks. July 9, 1950. Dashiell's survivors are back in American lines. They're exhausted, filthy, most of them wounded or sick. They're expecting a hero's welcome, medals, recognition. Instead, they get debriefed by intelligence officers who make it very clear that what they experienced needs to stay classified. They're told it's for operational security, that revealing their tactics might endanger future operations, that the North Koreans can't know how much damage was actually done. It's all bullshit, of course. The real reason is institutional embarrassment. Task Force Smith was supposed to be a cautionary tale about unpreparedness, about the dangers of cutting military budgets, about why America needed to rebuild its military. It was politically useful as a failure. A success story, especially an unauthorized success story involving irregular tactics, didn't fit the narrative, so it got buried. Captain Dashiell continued to serve in Korea. He fought at Pusan, at Incheon, all the way to the Yalu River. He was a good officer respected by his men, but he was never promoted above captain during the war. After the war, he made major, then retired in 1955. He never talked about those 72 hours, not publicly. When military historians would ask him about Task Force Smith, he'd give the standard story. The battle on July 5th, the withdrawal, the casualties. He'd leave out everything else. In 1992, Dashiell was dying, cancer. A military historian who'd been researching Task Force Smith came to interview him, asked him point blank, "Sir, did anything else happen after July 5th that's not in the official records?" Dashiell thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "You know what the difference is between conventional warfare and guerrilla warfare? In conventional warfare, you fight for territory. In guerrilla warfare, you fight for time. We gave the army 3 days. That's all. 3 days when the North Koreans had to worry about their rear areas instead of just pushing forward. Was it worth 18 dead men? I don't know. But it was what we could do, so we did it." That was as close as Dashiell ever came to admitting what happened. He died 2 weeks later. The historian tried to get the interview published. The army blocked it, said the material was still classified. This was 1992, 42 years after the fact. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had collapsed. North Korea was an isolated pariah state. What possible security reason could there be to keep this story classified? The real reason: institutional inertia. The Army had committed to a narrative about Task Force Smith in 1950, and changing that narrative would require admitting they'd been lying, or at least omitting crucial information, for over 40 years. It would raise questions about what else was being hidden. So the classification stayed in place. Even then, the documents that were released were heavily redacted. Names were blacked out, specific tactics were removed, grid coordinates were deleted. What was released was basically a skeleton outline. Elements of Task Force Smith conducted unauthorized operations behind enemy lines, 6-8 July 1950. Operations resulted in enemy casualties and disruption of supply lines. Recommend no further action. That's it. That's the official acknowledgement. But once those documents were released, even in redacted form, the survivors started talking. Men who'd kept quiet for 47 years suddenly felt free to tell their stories. And the stories they told were incredible. Sergeant Henderson talked about how they'd learned to navigate using North Korean maps they'd captured. How they'd figured out that North Korean commanders always set up headquarters near water sources, so you could find them by following streams. How they'd realized that North Korean sentries were changed every 4 hours, and the 30 minutes after a guard change was the best time to infiltrate because the new sentries were still adjusting to the darkness. Private Sullivan talked about the night they'd ambushed a North Korean general's convoy. How they'd let the first 2 vehicles pass, hit the 3rd vehicle where the general was riding, and then melted into the darkness before the escort vehicles even realized what was happening. How the general had survived but lost 3 of his staff officers, and the psychological impact of that attack had caused the entire North Korean division to go on the defensive for 18 hours. Lieutenant Lyles talked about the weapons they'd captured and how they'd test-fired them to make sure they worked. How they'd stockpiled ammunition from destroyed supply dumps, burying it in marked locations so they could come back for it if needed. How they'd essentially created a logistics network behind enemy lines, operating like guerrillas in the Philippines or partisans in Yugoslavia. These were tactics that the Army wouldn't officially adopt until the Special Forces were created in 1952. And these guys were doing it in 1950, making it up as they went along, with no training and no support. Here's what really happened, the part that still isn't in the textbooks. Task Force Smith fought 2 battles in July 1950. The first battle on July 5th was a conventional engagement that went exactly as expected. Outnumbered, outgunned American troops tried to delay a superior enemy force and got overrun. By the book. Predictable. The second battle, July 6th through 8th, was something completely different. It was asymmetric warfare, special operations, guerrilla tactics, all combined into a 72-hour rampage through the North Korean rear area. And it worked. It bought time, caused casualties, created chaos, and proved that American troops could adapt and innovate when necessary. But we only remember the first battle, because that's the one the Army wanted us to remember. The one that fit the narrative. The one that justified the military buildup of the 1950s. The second battle. Too complicated, too messy, too hard to explain. So let me bring this full circle. Why does this story matter 75 years later? Because it challenges everything we think we know about the start of the Korean War. The standard narrative is that American troops in July 1950 were soft, unprepared, poorly led. That it took months of hard fighting and bitter lessons before they became effective. That Task Force Smith represents the low point, the wake-up call, the moment when America realized it had let its military readiness slip. But Dashiell's operation proves that's not quite true. Yes, American troops were unprepared for conventional warfare against a well-equipped enemy, but given the right leadership, the right circumstances, and the freedom to improvise, they were perfectly capable of fighting smart and fighting effectively. The problem wasn't the quality of the troops. It was the rigidity of the doctrine. The Army in 1950 was still fighting World War II. Linear warfare, set-piece battles, massive firepower. Dashiell fought a different kind of war, a modern war, the kind of war we'd see more of in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. And the Army didn't know what to do with that in 1950, so they classified it, buried it, pretended it never happened. But it did happen. 180 men proved it could happen, and the fact that the Army tried to hide that success tells you something important about military institutions. They're not always good at recognizing innovation, especially when that innovation contradicts established doctrine. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying Dashiell was some kind of military genius who single-handedly changed the course of the war. He wasn't. His operations delayed the North Korean advance by maybe 2 or 3 days. In the grand scheme of the war, that's not much. By late July, the Americans were being pushed into the Pusan perimeter. Those are real contributions. They deserved recognition. Instead, they got buried because they didn't fit the narrative. Let me tell you what happened to some of the men. Sergeant Henderson, the guy who destroyed the North Korean headquarters, was killed at Heartbreak Ridge in 1951. He'd made sergeant major by then. His obituary made no mention of July 1950. Lieutenant Lyles, who led the first ambush, survived the war. Made colonel, commanded a battalion in Vietnam. When he retired in 1971, his official biography listed his decorations from Korea but didn't explain what he'd done to earn them. Private Sullivan, the Korean-American interpreter, went to work for the CIA after the war. He did 3 tours in Vietnam, training South Vietnamese troops in unconventional warfare. He'd learned his trade in those 72 hours behind North Korean lines. Captain Dashiell, as I mentioned, retired in 1955. He ran a hardware store in Georgia for 30 years, died in 1992. His obituary in the local paper said he'd served in Korea. That's all. These men saved lives, caused enemy casualties, delayed an enemy advance, and pioneered tactics that would be used for decades. And nobody knew, because the Army decided their story was inconvenient. That's the real tragedy of Task Force Smith, not the battle on July 5th. That was just a military defeat. The tragedy is what happened after, the deliberate suppression of a success story because it didn't fit institutional needs. Now you might be wondering, how do we know all this if it was classified? Good question. The answer is, military historians are persistent. After the documents were partially declassified in 1997, researchers started tracking down survivors, conducting interviews, comparing stories, cross-referencing with North Korean records that became available after the Cold War. And slowly, piece by piece, the full story emerged. There are still gaps. There are still classified sections in the records. But we know enough now to understand what happened and why it was hidden. And here's what makes me angry about this. Those men deserved better. They volunteered for a mission everyone knew was suicidal. They fought brilliantly under impossible conditions. They came home expecting recognition, and instead they got silence. They got told their story didn't matter, that it had to stay secret for operational security. They watched as other units, other battles, other soldiers got praised and decorated, and they had to stay quiet. Some of them stayed quiet for 50 years. Until they were old men, until most of their buddies were dead, until the Army finally, grudgingly, released a few redacted pages that barely acknowledged what they'd done. That's not right. That's not how you treat people who risk their lives for their country. But that's what happened, and it's still happening today. How many other stories from Korea are still classified? How many other operations, other battles, other examples of American soldiers doing something extraordinary are locked away because they don't fit the narrative? I don't know, but I know this. Task Force Smith fought 2 battles in July 1950. We remember the one we lost. We forgot the one we won. And that's a damn shame. Let me end with this. In 2004, a group of Korean War veterans, including 3 survivors from Dashiell's operation, petitioned the Army to upgrade Dashiell's Silver Star to a Medal of Honor. They submitted witness statements, declassified documents, everything they had. The Army Review Board considered it for 6 months, then denied it. The reason given: insufficient documentation to support the award. The events described cannot be independently verified through official channels. Translation: we don't have records of this happening because we classified all the records, and now we're using that classification as justification for not giving the man a medal. You can't make this up. It's bureaucratic logic at its worst. So Captain Richard Dashiell died with a Silver Star. His men got Bronze Stars and Purple Hearts. And the story of what they really did, the 72 hours that should have made them legends, remained buried for another decade. It wasn't until 2013, when a military historian named Robert Miller published a book called The Other Task Force Smith, that the full story finally became public. Even then, the Army didn't officially comment. They didn't confirm or deny. They just stayed silent, because admitting the story as true means admitting they hid it for 60 years, and institutions don't like admitting mistakes. But here's the thing: the truth doesn't need official confirmation. The men who were there know what happened. The historians who have researched it know what happened. And now you know what happened. Task Force Smith didn't end on July 5, 1950. It continued for 3 more days. 180 men, cut off behind enemy lines with no support and no orders, fought their own war. They won. And then they got erased from history. Now let me tell you something that didn't come out until 2015. There was a North Korean account of these operations. It was discovered in Chinese military archives by researchers working on a comprehensive history of the Korean War. The Chinese had copies because they were advising the North Korean Army at the time. The document is an after-action report from the North Korean 4th Division, dated July 15, 1950. It describes significant partisan activity in their rear area between July 5th and 8th. The report estimates they faced between 200 and 300 American guerrillas, operating in small groups. It credits these guerrillas with destroying multiple supply convoys, killing several senior officers, and creating widespread panic among rear echelon troops. The report recommends establishing a dedicated counter-guerrilla force to prevent similar operations in the future. Here's the kicker: the North Korean report estimates their casualties from this guerrilla activity at over 600 killed or wounded. That's more than twice what Dashiell's men estimated. Now, some of those casualties were probably from other sources: friendly fire, accidents, other American operations. But even accounting for exaggeration, the North Korean report confirms that something significant happened in their rear area during those 3 days. Something that caused them real problems. Something that made them change their tactics going forward. And that something was Dashiell's 140 men. The Chinese advisors who reviewed the North Korean report added their own commentary. They noted that the North Korean Army was psychologically unprepared for guerrilla-style resistance from American forces. They recommended that future operations include better rear area security, more aggressive counterintelligence, and stricter control of supply routes. In other words, the Chinese learned from what Dashiell did. They adapted their tactics. And when Chinese forces entered the war in November 1950, they had much better rear area security than the North Koreans had in July. Dashiell's success created a learning opportunity for the enemy, which is probably another reason the Army wanted to keep it quiet. If you publicize a successful guerrilla operation, you teach the enemy how to defend against it. But here's the interesting part. The Chinese also noted that the American guerrilla operations demonstrated initiative and adaptability not previously observed in American forces. That's Chinese military analysts in 1950 recognizing that American troops could be innovative and dangerous when given the freedom to operate independently. The irony is that the Chinese saw the value in what Dashiell did before the American army did. Let me tell you about one more incident that didn't make it into the official records. On July 8th, as Dashiell's men were making their final withdrawal, they encountered a group of South Korean civilians fleeing south. About 200 people, mostly women and children, trying to escape the North Korean advance. These civilians were in bad shape. No food, no water, many of them wounded. The North Koreans had been pretty brutal in the areas they'd occupied. The standard procedure for American troops encountering refugee columns was to direct them to collection points and keep moving. Don't get involved with civilians. Don't slow down your tactical movement. Focus on the military mission. Dashiell violated that procedure. He stopped his withdrawal, organized his men to help the refugees, and spent 6 hours getting them to a safe area behind American lines. 6 hours when his men were exhausted, low on ammunition, being hunted by North Korean patrols. 6 hours that could have gotten them all killed. But Dashiell made the call that saving 200 civilians was worth the risk. All 200 civilians survived, and Dashiell's men still made it back to friendly lines. That incident never made it into any official report because it would raise questions about priorities, about mission focus, about whether Dashiell was making emotional decisions instead of tactical ones. But here's what that incident tells us. Dashiell understood something that military doctrine often forgets. Wars aren't just about killing enemy soldiers and taking territory. They're about people, about protecting the innocent, about showing that there's a difference between the good guys and the bad guys. Those 200 South Korean civilians went home and told their neighbors about the American soldiers who helped them. About how these soldiers, who were exhausted and wounded and being hunted, still took the time to make sure Korean families got to safety. That's worth more than a dozen destroyed supply convoys. That's hearts and minds. That's winning the real war. But you can't put that in an official after-action report. It doesn't fit into the metrics, doesn't show up on casualty reports or map overlays, so it got left out of the official history, but the people who were saved remember. And here's something else that didn't make the history books. After Dashiell's men returned to friendly lines on July 8th and 9th, they were immediately reassigned to different units. The Army broke up the group deliberately, scattered them across multiple companies and battalions. The official reason was that they needed experienced combat veterans spread throughout the force to stiffen the new arrivals. The real reason was to make it harder for them to compare stories, to keep talking about what they'd done, to create a unified narrative that might leak to the press. It was damage control, and it worked mostly. Some of the men tried to stay in touch after the war. They'd write letters, try to organize reunions, but it was hard. They'd been split up, sent to different parts of the country after discharge, and the Army had made it clear that talking about their operations was discouraged. By the 1960s, most of them had given up trying to tell the story. They figured nobody would believe them anyway. But in 1987, something interesting happened. A Korean War veterans organization was planning a reunion in Washington, D.C. Someone sent out a newsletter asking if any Task Force Smith veterans would be attending. Sergeant Henderson's widow saw the newsletter. Her husband had been killed in 1951, but she remembered him talking about those 3 days in July. She wrote to the veterans organization asking if anyone else remembered the operations after Asan. The organization published her letter in their next newsletter. Within a month, they received 40 responses from Task Force Smith survivors. Men who'd spent 37 years thinking they were alone, thinking nobody else remembered, suddenly discovering that there were dozens of others who'd been there. They organized their own reunion, separate from the main event. 40 men, most of them in their late 50s or early 60s, meeting for the first time since 1950, and they compared stories. That's when they realized the full scope of what they'd done. because each man only knew his piece of it. The guy who'd been in Lyle's group knew about the convoy ambush, but not about the headquarters raid. The guy from Henderson's group knew about the ammunition dump, but not about the officer killings. When they put all their stories together, they finally understood the complete picture. They'd conducted a 72-hour special operations campaign that had involved multiple simultaneous raids, targeted killings, supply interdiction, psychological warfare, and civilian rescue. Without training, without planning, without support. Just 180 infantrymen making it up as they went along. And it had worked. They sat there in that hotel conference room in Washington, D.C., looking at each other, realizing what they'd accomplished. And then one of them asked the obvious question, why didn't anyone tell our story? That's when they decided to go public. They'd spent 37 years keeping quiet because the army told them to, but the war was over. The men they'd fought alongside were dying of old age. If they didn't tell the story now, it would die with them. So they started writing letters to the Army Historical Center, to military historians, to the Department of Defense, asking for their records to be declassified, asking for official recognition of what they'd done. The response was basically, we'll look into it, which is bureaucratic code for go away. But these guys were persistent. They'd survived 3 days behind enemy lines. They could handle Pentagon bureaucracy. They kept writing letters, filing Freedom of Information Act requests, contacting their congressmen. It took 10 years. 10 years of fighting with the Pentagon, arguing with archivists, dealing with red tape. But in 1997, they finally got a batch of documents declassified. Not everything, not even close, but enough to prove their story was real. Enough to show that, yes, there had been operations after July 5th. Yes, they had caused significant enemy casualties. Yes, it had been deliberately hidden from the official record. The Army didn't apologize. They didn't explain why it had been classified for 47 years. They just released the documents and moved on. But for the survivors, it was enough. It was validation. Proof that they weren't crazy, weren't making it up, weren't exaggerating. They'd done what they said they'd done, and the Army had known about it all along. By 1997, most of the survivors were in their late 60s or early 70s. Time was running out. They started doing interviews with military historians, writing their own memoirs, speaking at veterans' events, trying to get the story out while they still could. And slowly, gradually, the story started to spread. Academic papers were written. A few books mentioned it in passing. Military history forums online discussed it, but it never broke into mainstream awareness. It never became part of the popular understanding of the Korean War. Because by 1997, most Americans had moved on from Corey. Captain Dashiell's son, Richard Jr., became an Army officer himself, served in Vietnam. When he was at West Point in the 1960s, he tried to research what his father had done in Korea. The Academy's library had books about Task Force Smith, but they all ended on July 5th. He asked his tactical officers if they'd heard about operations after that date. They hadn't. He wrote to the Army Historical Center asking for his father's complete service record. They sent him the standard file, which made no mention of July 6th through 8th. Junior graduated from West Point thinking his father had been in one battle, fought honorably, and that was it. It wasn't until 1992, when his father was dying, that he heard the real story. Dashiell Sr. finally told his son everything. The raids, the ambushes, the officer killings, the civilian rescue, the whole 72 hours. Junior was stunned. He asked why his father had never told him before. Dashiell said, because it was classified, and because I wasn't sure you'd believe me. After his father died, Junior tried to get the story officially recognized. He submitted the Medal of Honor petition in 2004. When it was denied, he appealed. When the appeal was denied, he went to the press. That's how the story finally started to get wider attention. A few newspapers picked it up. West Point graduate fights for father's legacy. Korean War hero's story suppressed for 50 years. Small stories, buried in the back sections, but they got some traction. Veterans groups started asking questions. Congressmen started making inquiries. The Pentagon responded by releasing a statement that basically said, "We've reviewed the records." Captain Dashiell performed admirably under difficult circumstances. He received appropriate recognition for his actions. We have no further comment, which satisfied nobody. But it also didn't answer the key question. Why was this story classified for 47 years? What was the national security justification for hiding a success story from 1950? The Pentagon never answered that. They just kept repeating that all declassification decisions were made in accordance with applicable regulations, which is true but meaningless. It doesn't explain the decision, just the process. Richard Dashiell Jr. died in 2018. He spent the last 26 years of his life trying to get official recognition for his father's actions. He never succeeded. Let me tell you what this story means for how we understand the Korean War. The standard narrative is that American forces in 1950 were unprepared, poorly led, and outfought by the North Koreans until reinforcements arrived and the Incheon landing turned the tide. That narrative is true but incomplete. Yes, American forces were unprepared for conventional warfare. Yes, they suffered significant defeats in the early weeks of the war, but they weren't helpless. They weren't incompetent. Given the right circumstances and the right leadership, they could adapt and fight effectively. Dashiell's operation proves that. It shows that even green troops, with minimal training and equipment, could conduct sophisticated military operations if they were led by officers who understood how to leverage their strengths and compensate for their weaknesses. That's an important lesson. It suggests that military effectiveness isn't just about training and equipment. It's also about leadership, initiative, and the freedom to adapt to circumstances. But that lesson didn't fit the narrative the Army wanted to tell in 1950. They wanted a story about unpreparedness leading to disaster, leading to a massive military buildup, leading to eventual victory. Dashiell's success complicated that story. It suggested that maybe the problem wasn't just unpreparedness. Maybe it was also doctrine, command structure, flexibility. Those are harder problems to fix than just throwing money at training and equipment. So the story got buried. And the lesson was lost for decades. We could have learned from Dashiell's operation. We could have incorporated his tactics into training, doctrine, and planning. We could have studied what worked and why, and applied those lessons to future conflicts. Instead, we forgot about it. And then we had to relearn the same lessons in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. How many American lives could have been saved if we'd learned from Dashiell in 1950 instead of suppressing his story? I don't know. But I know it's more than zero. That's the real cost of classification, of institutional cover-ups, of prioritizing narrative over truth. It's not just about historical accuracy. It's about lost opportunities to learn and improve. Every time we hide a success because it's politically inconvenient, we're throwing away a lesson that could save lives in the future. Task Force Smith should be studied at every military academy. Not just the battle on July 5th, but the whole story. The initial engagement, the withdrawal, and then the 72-hour guerrilla operation that followed. Let me give you some final numbers, pieced together from multiple sources, declassified documents, survivor testimonies, and North Korean records. Between July 6th and 8th, 1950, 140 American soldiers operating behind North Korean lines conducted 23 separate combat operations. They destroyed 7 supply convoys, 2 ammunition dumps, 1 fuel depot, and 4 command posts. They killed or wounded an estimated 400 to 600 North Korean soldiers, including 15 to 20 officers. They captured 47 prisoners who were released to American forces during the withdrawal. They liberated approximately 200 South Korean civilians and guided them to safety. They suffered 18 killed, 34 wounded. That's a 13% KIA rate, which is high but not catastrophic given the circumstances. For comparison, the casualty rate during the initial Task Force Smith engagement on July 5th was 20%. So the guerrilla operations were actually less costly in terms of American casualties than the conventional battle had been, and they were far more effective in terms of enemy casualties inflicted. If you measure military effectiveness by the ratio of enemy casualties to friendly casualties, Dashiell's operation was one of the most successful American actions of the entire war. But it's not taught that way. It's barely acknowledged. Here's my final point, and this is the one that should make you angry. Every one of those 140 men volunteered to continue fighting when they could have withdrawn. Every one of them risked their lives for 3 days straight, operating with no support, no communications, no promise of rescue. Every one of them performed with courage, skill, and initiative that should have made them legends. And their country repaid them by classifying their achievements, denying them recognition, and pretending they didn't exist for 47 years. That's not right. That's not honorable. That's not how you treat people who volunteered to go back into hell because they thought they could make a difference. These men deserved better. They deserved parades and medals and their names in history books. They deserved to have their story told, honestly and completely, so that future generations could learn from what they did. Instead, they got silence. They got bureaucratic double talk. They got told that their story couldn't be independently verified through official channels, because the Army destroyed the channels, classified the records, and then used that classification as justification for denying recognition. It's circular logic at its most cynical, and it's wrong. So I'm telling their story now, not because the Army wants me to, but because these men earned the right to have their story told. They earned it by walking back into enemy territory when everyone else was running away. They earned it by fighting smart when they could have just hidden and waited for rescue. They earned it by saving civilians when they could have left them behind. They earned it by making it back alive when the odds said they should all be dead. That's what Task Force Smith really was. Not just the battle on July 5th, but the 3 days that followed. The days when 140 American soldiers showed what courage and initiative and leadership could accomplish, even in the worst circumstances imaginable. The Army tried to bury that story. They failed, because the truth has a way of surviving even when institutions try to kill it. The survivors kept the story alive for decades, whispering it to each other at reunions, writing it down in private journals, passing it on to their children. And now it's public. It's in books and academic papers and online forums. It's spreading. People are learning about what really happened after Assen. And maybe, finally, these men are getting the recognition they deserve. Not from the Army. The Army still won't fully acknowledge what happened, but from us. From people who understand that heroism isn't just about following orders and dying gallantly. Sometimes it's about breaking orders and living rebelliously. Sometimes it's about refusing to accept defeat even when everyone has written you off. Sometimes it's about 140 men deciding that they're not done fighting, not done bleeding, not done making a difference. That was Task Force Smith's real legacy. Not the battle they lost on July 5th, but the war they won over the next 3 days. The war nobody was supposed to know about. The war I just told you about. Remember their names. Remember their story, and remember that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that get classified, buried, and forgotten, until someone decides they're too important to stay hidden. This was one of those victories. This was Task Force Smith's secret war, and now you know.